My name's Jim Miller. I'm the co-organizer of this sequence of conferences with Helena Rosenblatt. This conference has focused on the many faces of liberalism. In February of next year at the New School, there will be a two-day event that will focus on democracy and liberalism, and very much add in a sharper focus on democracy in itself, in its history, and in its complicated, I believe, relationships with liberalism. Our panel this evening is really the one panel that joins the two conferences together. And I thought it would be, before really turning to the panelists, I wanted to say something about the premises of our conferences, and because they're conveyed elliptically in the title of this panel, which says liberalism versus democracy. The question mark was added later to soften my original title. Helena and I discovered we were writing at roughly the same time books on parallel topics, and we're taking a broadly similar methodological approach. And to put it very simply, we had both been touched in different ways by the methodological work of Quentin Skinner as an intellectual historian, and specifically historian of political thought, who emphasizes from a Wittgensteinian background to take very seriously the words that are actually used and the concepts as they're deployed in discursive practices in different historical times and places, rather than to assume that if you see the same word at different times and places, it means the same thing, and also as an heuristic to warn against applying retrospectively terms that we use today onto previous times and places and what their beliefs and practices were. And as a result of taking that approach, both Helena and I, to start with quite independently, had ended up coming to the conclusion that there is a broad, particularly in the world of general, ordinary discourse, a tendency to conflate liberalism and democracy in the United States that has been pretty deeply entrenched in most of my lifetime, actually. It was deeply entrenched in the political science I was taught. I majored in political science and as an undergraduate. And it seemed to both of us that it was a mistake historically, but by separating out the differences, it might lead to an interesting conversation about how these categories and concepts ought to be articulated, particularly if you can show historically that they've often stood in tension, and I'm going to suggest contradiction. I want to put my cards on the table. Helena did this earlier today. I'm just going to read 5 paragraphs about liberalism and its relationship to democracy. Liberalism's a relatively late addition to our political lexicon, as Helena's explained. What I want to add to what she said this morning, and this is quite unlike democracy, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, liberalism in the United States was actually only introduced as a key word in term of art during the time of Woodrow Wilson and around people connected to the journal The New Republic and even the founders of my university, the New School. They meant it as a distinguishing label for people who had been Teddy Roosevelt progressives who became Wilson Democrats, and in contradistinction to socialists who pursued a revolutionary program. And they saw themselves as pragmatic social democrats in the model of, say, the Fabians in England. So here's what I want to emphasize about the differences between democracy. Democracy, when it first appeared in ancient Greece, it had almost nothing to do with what we think of liberalism in any of the possible definitions we've discussed today. Nothing. It presupposed shared norms, a shared religion horizon, a shared projection of egalitarian ideals. It revolved around periodic public assemblies in which all citizens met as one and had as its characteristic procedure the random selection of citizens to fill almost all the key offices of justice, administration, and government. As Socrates discovered at his trial for impiety and corrupting the youth in 399 BC, the ordinary citizens of ancient Athens had little patience for nonconformists, or what Bill Galston was calling individualists. Their collective freedom to wield their power was perfectly compatible with the complete subjection of the individual to the community. And perhaps most importantly for our purposes today, Athens was an exclusionary nativist community. Only people who had both parents who had been born in Athens could become citizens. It is the most exclusionary nativist form of rule that you can possibly imagine. And you could make an argument that the exclusions of Athenian democracy, including women and slaves and all foreigners from participation, was what made the robust directness of Athenian democracy possible. But whatever it was not liberal in any sense that I recognize. Moreover, modern democracy, which I think revolves around a certain conception of popular sovereignty that was utterly alien to the thinking of the ancient Greeks and was most powerfully expressed as a democratic category in Rousseau's political thought, in his concept of the general will, also has no necessary connection to liberalism. This was shown in the course of the French Revolution, but even the first Protestant champions of the idea of popular sovereignty in the 16th century summoned the power of the people for the express purpose of dethroning rulers with whose religious views they disagreed. As Edmund S. Morgan put it, it was not religious liberty they sought, but the elimination of wrong religions. Liberalism, I believe, as Bill Galston has said, profoundly grows out of a modus vivendi to stop the slaughter that in part was being generated by early Protestant conceptions of popular sovereignty. That's all I wanted to say in terms of putting my cards on the table, but I wanted to then acknowledge that there are many different ways to approach the relationships between liberalism and democracy. And in our conferences, we've tried to be as open and pluralistic as possible. And in that spirit, I wanted to explain the order in which people will speak. For those of you who haven't been at previous sessions, people will speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll have conversation among the panelists. I'm not going to give big introductions. All of you have a program which lists all the accomplishments of the various speakers. I want to start with James Cloppenburg because he's written a magisterial work called Toward Democracy, which is notably different in its emphasis and approach to telling the story of democracy than what I've just said. So I've chosen, and he knew I was going to ask him to go first, deliberately to lead us off, and then I will turn to Nadia Urbinati, Ira Katznelson, and Michael Kazin. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks all of you for being here in the late afternoon. I've been studying the conjunction of liberalism and democracy for 40 years now. My first book was a study of exactly the moment that Jim was just referring to, when people coming out of socialism move into social democracy and people coming out of liberalism move toward progressivism. So it does seem to me clear that there has been this tension from the beginning of both a democratic tradition and a liberal tradition, but I think beginning in the early 20th century it became clear that it was possible to bring these two together, and that's what I've been trying to study my entire career. Both liberalism and democracy, I think, are complex phenomena. I'm a historian, so my first sentence is always, it's more complicated than you thought. I'd say that both of these are constituted historically by the struggles fought by people who were committed to ideals that are not only in tension with each other, but that are essentially contested. The meanings of freedom, equality, justice have changed over time, and they have changed across cultures. So the idea that there is going to be a single conception of liberalism or democracy that anyone has agreed upon or that we will agree upon, I think, is a phantom. After having written this book about the rise of social democracy, I wrote a book called The Virtues of Liberalism that was focused on the inadequacy of thinking about liberalism strictly in terms of rights. And that's a point that a lot of people have made in various ways. It was also about obligations. It was also about the duties that one owes to the common good. It may be that liberalism dates from the early 19th century, as Helena noted earlier today, but the word liberality comes into the English language from Latin. And from the beginning, it had a dual significance. It meant either generosity toward one's fellows, or it meant licentiousness. And that sort of dual possibility, that protean word, has been part of the liberal tradition, I think, as it's been understood by its champions and its critics from the beginning. I argued in that book that liberalism, as it emerges in the United States in the 18th and 19th centuries, to use the word anachronistically, had religious and political and economic dimensions. The United States, as a democratic nation, emerged from the blending of various inherited traditions. Protestant Christianity, classical republicanism, Lockean empiricism, Scottish common sense philosophy, and Enlightenment rationalism. All of those components have been involved and have been changing in relation to each other ever since. In the book that Jim referred to, Toward Democracy, even though it goes back to the ancient world, in order in part to make the point Jim just made, that Athenian democracy and Roman republicanism are quite different from what we think of as modern democracy, the book begins really with the wars of religion, because I think it is quite true that democracy is rooted in an understanding that something has to be done to keep people simply from butchering each other. And so we go first through a phase of absolutism, monarchism, absolute authority of the monarch, to a world in which people begin experimenting with the ideas of popular sovereignty that then come to fruition in the 18th and 19th century. It's true, I think, that democracy requires an institutional structure, requires the rule of law, it requires free and fair elections, but I think it requires more than that. I think it requires an orientation toward the ideals of autonomy and equality and popular sovereignty. But beyond that, it requires certain predispositions, certain sensibilities, certain cultural foundations, pillars I call them, without which I think a democratic culture cannot survive, let alone thrive. And those, I think, don't get the attention they need. First of those is a commitment to deliberation, to discourse, to debate as a way of making decisions. Second, to pluralism or diversity, toleration, as we were saying earlier today. And finally, to what I call an ethic of reciprocity. We'd call it the golden rule, if that's more familiar. But without that, one who loses an election would never agree to cede power to the opposition. All of these, I think, are values that have to be balanced against each other. If they aren't, just to take one example, if majority rule is your only value, any group of three can yield a majority of two committed to enslaving the other one, right? So you need a robust conception of autonomy to push back against something as simple as the idea of majority rule. So I think of liberal democracy as a heuristic or an ideal type. As Anne pointed out, it's certainly not a reality for most people in the world now or ever. It is a horizon that's always receding historically, no matter what culture you're in, because it's not only about laws and institutions, but it's also an ethical ideal, as John Dewey never tired of pointing out. So there are tensions between liberalism and democracy, certainly, as Jim pointed out, but I think they should be seen in the 21st century as mutually constitutive, as dynamic, and as multidimensional. So why is liberal democracy in such crisis in the 21st century? From my perspective as a historian, the underlying reasons are cultural. They are not only the absence of commitments to robust ideals of autonomy, equality, and popular sovereignty, but also an absence of commitment to the underpinnings of democracy, to deliberation, to pluralism, and above all, to an ethic of reciprocity. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm continuing on the same line because I almost agree on everything that you said. So it seems that I have nothing to say more, but something more I have to say, actually. So I like to push a little bit further this issue about liberal-democracy and say that the liberal democracy package is so widely admired today that people tend to forget that it is in fact a package. And as also has been said, it is the outcome of a long history, sometimes contradictory, sometimes in conflict. From the moment in which the universal suffrage was achieved, liberalism became more anti-democratic, and when the split between the two was achieved, the situation was dramatic. So fascism was achieved when it was able to separate the two and to claim against both of them. So my point thus is against forms of nationalism or populism re-emerging today, the project could be perhaps that of reuniting more than before the liberal and the democracy two moments. Thus, this package needs to be seen together in trajectory, but also today in the 21st century to be appreciated as one made of two, one reality made of two components. So political scientists have identified the achievement of constitutional democracy after World War II with the achievement, indeed, of liberal democracy. And this morning, Moen told us that liberalism during the Cold War became a kind of ideology, and we have to save ourselves or this legacy from that ideology. So liberal democracy with the hyphen as it has been constructed through the Cold War may be perhaps the problem we have to get rid of, or at least to moderate or to change a little bit. Why I say so? Because there is today the assumption that it's possible to have not only liberal democracy, but also illiberal democracy. According to me, this is the real problem we should consider. Because when Orban writes, for instance, that democracy can be in liberal form, and thus I am Democrat, although I am not liberal, we should be very concerned about this disjunction. So in the hyphen terminology that we are familiar with, it seems possible to oppose liberalism to democracy by ascribing protection of freedom to liberalism alone and seeing democracy as autonomy, power, and majority rule. I think this is somehow problematic today, in some sense. Now, although ancient and modern democracy, of course, are different on many concerns, they're very different. They have something in common, though. The idea that it's possible to be in dissent or dissenting or change your mind and thus vote. And this question of changing our mind, the question of dissent, is one of the reasons why democracy needs inside of itself individual liberty. Because dissent and the ability of say the opposite of what you said yesterday, and the ability of being in disagreement even with yourself and with your loyalty, which is what democracy allows you to do, because this is what about majority-minority is about, then this means that democracy has inside the ability of having liberty, individual liberty, and the liberty of free speech in the public, freedom of association with others, and freedom of the press today, we would say. So there is a sense of potential for internal evolution of liberalism from within. Why I say so? Because in my view, this has been also seen in the concern that many political theorists and democratic theorists had when they had to respond to fascism or totalitarianism. I'm quoting from Hans Kelsen, 1945. The will of the community in a democracy is always created through a running discussion between majority and opposition, through free consideration of arguments for and against a certain regulation of a subject matter. This discussion takes place not only in Parliament, but also and foremost at political meetings, in newspapers, books, and other vehicles of public opinion. A democracy without public is a contradiction in terms, insofar as public opinion can arise only when and where intellectual freedom, freedom of speech, press, and religion are guaranteed. Democracy coincides with political, although not necessarily economic, liberalism. I take to be this an important point to stress, and thus, just to conclude, because I think I'm running against time, I would like to use an expression or a very interesting generalization made by Kant when he was talking about peace. And I apply what Kant said about the perpetual peace to what I just said about liberalism and democracy, or democracy with liberty or liberalism inside. So I say thus that liberal/democracy is a pleonasm in a very same way in which Kant used to say of the perpetual peace. I'm quoting from Kant. Since peace means the end of all hostilities, a mere suspension of hostility is not peace, but a truce. Hence, to attach the adjective perpetual to peace is already suspiciously close to pleonasm. So if we attach liberalism and democracy, we imply that they can stay separated and can develop well separately. And I think this can be a pleonasm, and I use it in the same way. So I would say that a counter argument against that comes from the fascists themselves. We forget sometimes that when they arise in the 20s, and I don't want to make any parallel, but simply to give you an idea for why I'm insisting so much on keeping together always liberalism and democracy, fascism was neither a form of democracy without liberalism, nor was it democracy, nor was political liberalism. It was none of them. And indeed, I just printed the manifesto of fascism of 1925. Among the many things against liberalism, against socialism, is against democracy. Democracy is a kingless regime infested by many kings who are sometimes more exclusive, tyrannical, and destructive than one. Thus, this means that these many tyrants are a fantastic way of neutralizing tyranny. So thank you.
Well, those were really the first two terrific start. Colleague Cloppenburg gave us a very rich account of the elements that compose democracy, not as a fixed element, but which compose the family of, and without the elements you mentioned, autonomy, popular sovereignty, etc., and the undergirding values, we don't have democracy. I want to ask, as my first question, what are the elements that compose the liberal family, or at least the political liberal family, without which we don't have a family of instances? Not that liberalism is fixed, but that absent these elements, there is no such thing as political liberalism. And the list is familiar. Bill Galston already spoke about government by consent. I would add to individual rights, which always is on the list, public rights. Press freedom, for example, isn't just a matter of the individual, it's a matter of collective expression and collective opposition. Rule of law, not just law, but something beyond a law. Fascism had law, communism had law, but liberal law is a rule of law, and of course the meaning of that is a subject of great debate. That would be third. Fourth, and not in lexical order, just as a list, political representation, which didn't originate with liberals and liberalism, but absent political representation under modern condition, we cannot have liberalism. And finally, the but more contingently as a historical matter, toleration. But pluralism, respect for pluralism, and therefore toleration is a key feature, and I would argue without which you might have some forms of liberalism, but it would be a very injured form of liberalism. Now, if these are the core elements, none fixed, but no decent regime can do without them, then what we're asked to think about is its relationship to democracy. And democracy, really building on what has already been said, entails minimally rules of participation, entails peaceful transitions of leadership, and entails procedures that produce provisional policy outcomes. So one question we might ask is, what are the mechanisms of connection between democracy and liberalism with the characteristics I mentioned? And there, in addition to norms, we have to talk about institutions. Institutions that have come to include political parties, parliaments, elections. These are the sites within which the key liberal principles and key democratic practices must get expressed. And therefore, as those institutions weaken or become illegitimate or become sites of anxiety about their capacity to solve large problems, both liberalism and democracy, alone, separately, and together, come to be in deep problems. But if we take a longer view, not just about the present, it seems to me there are three sets of issues or zones, I like to call them zones of transaction, which are central to liberalism and about which democratic contestation debates and arrives at provisional policy outcomes. And the deepest premise, one could argue, of the liberal liberal ontology, as it were, is the existence of separate spheres of state, economy, and civil society, not reducible one to the other. And therefore, the most important political questions are how state-to-state relations will be managed, how state-economy relations will be managed, and how state-civil society relations will be managed. And the premise of that remark is to say that liberalism itself is premised on the existence of modern states. It is stateness, as it were, as a value all the way down. The question for liberals is how to control that potential monster, and how to do it, how to protect people from predatory rule and predatory rulers, how to maintain an independent economy and an independent civil society, and how to manage external relations so as to protect the capacity to have these separate spheres. But, and here I want to close, liberalism qua liberalism, married to democracy or not married to democracy, but especially when married to democracy, has three profound zones of vulnerability. And we're seeing them at work today. One is the following: liberals and liberalism, and I would say Democrats and democracy, thinking of the ancients, have never solved the problem of membership. Once you have a polity with boundaries, the question of who inside those boundaries and who gets into those boundaries from outside remains an astonishingly vexing and difficult question. The only thing liberals and the liberal tradition have to say, quoted earlier when Locke was quoted, is a criterion of rationality. A liberal citizen is meant to be a citizen who can reason and deliberate and participate in the process as an autonomous, independent player. But who is autonomous? Well, in long history, certainly women weren't thought to be capable of autonomous reason and deliberation. Slaves weren't. You could make a long list. So this is a cultural question, not just a political question of who qualifies as a member. And liberalism and democracy have been quite content to have very narrow definitions as well as broad definitions. Second of the three great vulnerabilities comes in the area of security, in the stateness of states. Hamilton writes in Federalist 23 that under conditions of exigency, and I quote precisely, there shall be no constitutional shackles. Well, if liberalism is about limited state, is about shackling the state and shackling democracy, what happens when the circumstances of exigency are either understood to be or actually are sufficiently great that the very durability of liberal democracies is called into question? Shall there be really no constitutional shackles? And finally, one we're going to devote the evening session to, so I won't go on at all about it, is the question of property and the relationship of property and sovereignty. How freestanding and or how regulated. And I would say that as we know, there's an enormous range of answers that Democrats and liberals give, but there's no fixed set of answer from within liberalism or from within democracy. Final sentences. It seems to me that the marriage of liberalism and democracy not only faces these areas of vulnerability, but under some conditions, the democratization of liberalism poses deep problems for liberalism under certain forms of the politicization of questions of membership, security, and property. And we see that exactly at work in American politics today. Finally, I want everyone to reread or read an essay I've just reread with some students of Judith Shklar on obligation and loyalty, reminding us that obligation and loyalty are not precisely the same. Obligation is in the realm of reason. You spoke earlier, Bill, about obligation. Obligation comes out of being located in determinate circumstances. Therefore, liberal citizens, as democratic players, have obligations, not just rights. But loyalty is a matter of emotion, and no decent liberal democracy will survive absent loyalty. That is the emotional constellation that ties people to it and makes them willing to defend it. And the great question for us, it seems to me, is that under conditions of deep contestation about membership, security, and property, how do we achieve sufficient and robust but decent kinds of loyalty and obligation to secure the marriage of liberalism and democracy?
I got to admit at the beginning, I'm a bit of a fraud here. I've never written about the marriage or divorce between liberalism and democracy. I'm a historian of social movements and politics, so that's what I'll talk about. And I want to raise the question, which can ramify in different directions, why is there not, and for the most part never has been, a liberal social movement called that, or I think in many ways even by most definitions. There have been liberal intellectuals, there have been liberal politicians, liberal theorists, of course, but difficult to identify a liberal mass movement. The United States, for example, the major movements in US history, 19th century and into the middle and late 20th century have been the prohibitionist movement, which lasted for 100 years, which is certainly not a liberal movement if we're talking about toleration and of religious difference and of moral beliefs. Obviously, the socialist movement was not. The labor movement, I don't think, was either. One could argue the abolitionists and suffrage movements were in certain ways. But I think they were all in different ways about democracy, certainly, about those who felt exploited by those on top and wanted to have a voice that was enshrined in law, and they also wanted to have power. And liberals, I think, have always had an ambiguous relationship with power. And we've been talking about around that in some ways all day long, I think. Also, I think, and going back to Skinnerian ways of analyzing the kind of wonderful books that both Helena and Jim have written, do this really beautifully for their different subjects. As was mentioned before, it's really only 100 years ago with the Wilson administration and the Wilsonian intellectuals that liberalism becomes a term that people talk about. But it's certainly true, too, that Wilson was primarily influenced in using that term, I think, by Gladstone and by the Liberal Party in Britain. There's an old book by a historian named Robert Kelly about the Gladstonian persuasion, transatlantic persuasion, where he puts Gladstone right in the center of that. And Gladstone was Wilson's, favorite. He was his hero when he was younger. And of course, as most of you know, he hankered after a parliamentary system for a while before changing his mind. But I think it's important to note this because when the term gets appropriated by other politicians, Franklin D. Roosevelt especially, and turns into a synonym for the New Deal, it has a different connection than it did, I think, for Wilson, and for the most part than it did for Gladstone, too, and for most of these movements. It has a connection, as we know, to economic reform, to positive liberty, to the embryonic welfare state that has in many ways retreated in recent years, Obamacare notwithstanding. And the term, as we know, since the 1960s has been has adopted if that's the right verb, a taint of elitism. We all know that. Steve Fraser, a very fine labor historian, wrote a book last year called Limousine Liberal, where he talked in wonderfully complex ways about why that term took off. It was invented by a Democrat, Mario Procaccino, when he was running for mayor against John Lindsay, who did proclaim himself a liberal, but also was, as you all remember, many of you remember, was very much sort of had an elitist way of carrying himself and speaking and dressing. And now liberalism, of course, means, for most Americans, I think, almost anything but economic reform, a certain proclivity to support environmentalism, cosmopolitan values and tastes, racial and gender justice. It's a far cry from the way FDR used the term and from the way many people on the socialist left used the term in the 30s as well, especially during the Popular Front. Harry Bridges, the longtime head of the Longshore Union on the West Coast, who was probably a member of the Communist Party for many years, gave a speech in 1939 where he hailed the victory of a pro-labor Democrat in California by saying the victory was won by all liberal, laboring, and progressive people. Notice how these also for him, synonyms, basically. And so I think, I was thinking about this session, for some reason, the famous line from Peter Brooks' Marat Sade popped into my head. We want our rights and we don't care how. We want a revolution now. In many ways, I think that's a contradiction in terms. Because as much as liberalism is associated with rights, has been historically and very much is today as well, few people make revolutions or form social movements, at least mass social movements, because they feel deprived of their rights. They do them because, as I mentioned before, they feel they're powerless, they're exploited by those who have power, they want a voice, they want a way to get power over their lives, not because, primarily at least, they feel their rights have been violated. To return to the absence of a liberal movement in the United States, at least, there are many people who care very deeply about civil liberties and human rights, of course, here and around the world, and it's accurate to call them liberals. They certainly have organizations, NGOs especially, with a good deal of influence. The primary liberal organization in the United States today, I think, is the American the ACLU. The ACLU was founded almost 100 years ago. It was founded out of a social movement, the movement against World War I in this country, which involved Democratic segregationists and Republican pro-civil rights progressives like Robert La Follette, socialists and feminists and anarchists and other groups. It began as the legal arm of a social movement, but over its history, the ACLU has migrated until at least recently to a more neutral stance, as we know, about defending the First Amendment rights of everybody, Nazis, socialists, anarchists, civil rights demonstrators, whoever. But more recently, since Donald Trump's been elected, it's become the legal arm, again, of a social movement, though one might even call it, might call it an insurgency. Not sure it's actually a social movement. That is the resistance. Is the resistance concerned, is this a liberal resistance? Certainly most of the people in it probably consider themselves to be liberals. But again, I don't think they're primarily interested in rights, not primarily interested in protecting their rights, primarily interested in protecting the gains of a liberal state, perhaps, and mass movements against the attempt by Donald Trump and his administration and his supporters in the Republican Party to erode them and to demolish them, if possible. Environmental protection, healthcare protection, corporate regulation, labor unions, and the rule of law more generally. And finally, to talk a little bit at the end about our current controversy, debate in this country, which of course is Christine Blasey Ford versus Judge Kavanaugh and the masses of people on both sides. Interesting in a way that the defense that Kavanaugh has made and those conservatives, mostly conservatives, who defend him is one based on rights, the rights of the accused. Whereas those who believe in and defend Christine Blasey Ford, of which I include myself among them, I think are more concerned with exploitation, with the power of men over women, with the way in which these accusations, these kind of harassment and sexual abuse, which she and many other women have suffered, are devalued and denied and pushed under the rug. So again, those who defend Ford, who consider themselves liberals, are really thinking about power. And those who defend Brett Kavanaugh at least define what they're doing in the language of rights. So there's an interesting contradiction there, perhaps, or at least kind of complexity. Like Jim, I'm a historian, and so I take refuge in complexity. But in many ways, I think we're arguing, when we argue about Ford and Kavanaugh, you know, we're arguing about who has the power to define, you know, what is going on, who has the power to define what the people actually want, whether women and their supporters have the power to define that, or whether men who say this has not been proved, and so Kavanaugh should get the benefit of the doubt and should be confirmed to the highest court in the land for a lifetime appointment, really are the ones who should get the benefit of the doubt. So these are some reflections on why I think it's very difficult to talk about a liberal mass movement, and that's part of the reason I think why liberalism is in trouble, and arguably has always been in trouble as a positive vision, because it's not a positive vision which really inspires and grips people to devote their lives to fighting for it, as opposed to fighting for democracy, fighting against the exploitation of class, gender, nation, or race. Thank you.
As in previous panels, I'd like to give the panelists a chance to ask each other questions or make comments on what you've heard. I have a question I want to ask because I've heard it several times today now that liberalism has no positivity. I don't believe it. And I'm going to speak in very colloquial terms here to try to get at something that is in the background, I think, of knowing what everyone on this panel has written. I think in the period, and now just talk in the United States, the birthplace of populism is America. It was born in the United States, as of course Michael Kazin knows. That's where the term originates. It is a popular mass movement that rises up to put pressure on political parties, and it forms for a brief time its own political party. It fades away, and in its wake we get progressivism and then liberalism of the classic American sense, in which liberalism and democracy are conjoined as one by Woodrow Wilson, quite self-consciously. What comes out of that moment, I don't think Patrick Deneen is here any longer. There you are, I was not sure, is that, you know, there is an interpretation of Wilson which, based on his manuscripts and early writings, I think has some, there's something to it, that what he tries to do in this fusion is create a very positive conception of state power, which leads directly to the modern administrative state and the regulatory state. And that in the minds of most Americans, to say that liberalism is purely negative would make no sense. The people who are hostile to liberalism often see it as an enormous administrative apparatus that oversees many of the liberal protections that Ira was talking about in terms of enforcing the observation of individual rights, making sure that political representation is applied equally, workplace safety rules, statistical bureaus, et cetera, et cetera. And eventually, this apparatus takes over the question of security and creates secret organizations. The FBI is perhaps the first that operate in secrecy in the name of a state of emergency, which to begin with under Wilson had to do with the Red Scare. So it seems to me there is this kind of positivity about liberalism, and that the part of what fuels later populist revolts in the United States is the sense that what's happened here is that a technocratic elite of credentialed experts has been implanted in charge of state power at great remove from ordinary people, and that in fact liberalism in this form, it's a fake democracy because it actually deeply fears ordinary people. It fears what they would say, it fears how they would act, it hides behind the cloak of protecting minorities because it's fearful of an actual majority, and it actually is a complete sham as a democracy, and that part of this apparatus is invested in suppressing, molding, and manipulating a popular will. And so I'd like somebody on the panel to speak to this, what I think is a fairly obvious fear of a form of liberalism that, you know, maybe it's not accurate or true, but yeah.
I'd like to respond to it just quickly. Maybe other people probably do too. But well, I mean, in some ways, you're backing up what I was saying. I think. I mean, nobody demanded an administrative state. There was not, you know, people didn't go to the polls demanding an administrative state. Of course, administrative state, as you know, evolved because it was the only way to enforce certain bills that people did want. But there's a wonderful book some of you probably know, by the political scientist Elizabeth Sanders, called The Roots of Reform, in which she talks about how the populists and other anti-monopoly groups composed mostly of workers and farmers in the late 19th century, they wanted a more powerful government, but they didn't want a more powerful state. You know, they wanted people basically to get all this great stuff from the state and get this protection from the state without having a bureaucracy carrying it out. Now, you can argue that was naive. You can't have a big state without a state building, but nevertheless, that's what they wanted. And I think in some ways the the germ of the problem that liberals and the liberal state have had, with the exception of 30s to the early 60s, and talk about that, if we have time, is that the administrative state has never been popular, even though bureaucracy has never been popular. However, what people get from that state has been popular.
Jim.
Yeah, I think this is really the central issue in 20th century American political history, and the way you described it, Jim, I think is the controversy that historians of progressivism have been fighting over for half a century now. There are multiple wings of progressivism, including the wing that begins with the New Republic liberals and Louis Brandeis, that really does see itself in its origin as doing the people's business, as carrying forward much of what was a popular demand for regulation. What happens very quickly, though, is it comes to be perceived as something by which elites manipulate the people, as you said. And the contrast between Max Weber on democracy, on bureaucracy on the one hand, and John Dewey and his acolytes and students in the New Deal on the other is a really striking contrast, because Weber sees, before there's any bureaucracy to speak of in the United States, precisely what the promise of bureaucracy is and the reason why it's going to be in such tension with democracy, whereas Dewey and his allies believe that you can democratize bureaucracy. Many of the New Deal agencies were put in place with the understanding that they would be administered locally. Now, when you ask yourself how the New Deal is going to be administered in Selma in a way that's fair, you see the problem that Weber had already put his finger on. Right. The universality of rules and the particularity of local governance are in tension with each other. And so I think the challenge has always been to take this regulatory ideal that comes into being exactly when you identify it and make it do what it was designed to do rather than what it ends up doing. Now, Walter Lippmann, one of the founders of the New Republic, was the first person to identify this in his book, Public Opinion. His first two books are very much a call for this kind of democratic reform in public opinion. Having been part of Wilson's inquiry during World War I, he says, wait a minute, it's actually very easy to manipulate the people. It's very easy for elites to cover themselves with a mask of democracy and instead decide how it is that the people are going to come to knowledge, or what's going to count as knowledge. And from that point on, that critique of democracy as ruled by elites becomes a part of social science, and it's a tension that I don't think anybody has resolved.
So, when very shortly after Franklin Roosevelt took his oath of office, Herbert Hoover wrote an article in the Saturday Evening Post in which he complained bitterly that Roosevelt had stolen the word liberal. We are all liberals in America, he said. This is our common value. It's not a partisan value, and it means liberty. It was a certain version of an argument that Hartz made, and I know we don't completely agree with Hartz, Hartz made 2 decades later, but in effect, whether or not you think Hartz had it right or wrong, the punchline it was that for Hartz and for Hoover, the issue wasn't whether Americans were liberals, but what kind of liberalism we should wish to have. And once we ask that question, it seems to me 2 big puzzles, again, more puzzles come into play. What kind of liberalism should we wish to have with respect to the thrust that Tocqueville put front and center, not just equality, but popular sovereignty, which is the essence of one essence of democracy. Chapter 4 of Democracy in America, Tocqueville writes the most extraordinary sentence. He says, in America, the people rule as God reigns in the universe. And it's called Popular Sovereignty, that chapter. Well, the people, who are the people? Is it a multitude of people with proper names, like us? Is it an abstract people? We, the people of the United States, is not proper named people. It's a concept of a collective. Or is it something in between the two, a kind of citizens bound by rules, procedures, and norms, which is, I think, where the founders wanted it, essentially. But the first big puzzle for liberal Democrats is how do we move between and among these levels of popular sovereignty? And when should the people appear in different modes, in their mode as constituent powers the abstract we the people, legitimating a regime, or in the form of a multitude, or in the form of a institutionalized citizenry. And the second big puzzle, and I'll stop with this, is the fact that the liberal tradition itself, leave democracy to the side, I think it's true of democracy too, well, the liberal tradition is very porous. It is not, all those values I spoke about earlier, they're not just high walls and thick walls around them. There are permeable walls. Liberalism has bonded over time with the Republican tradition. It's the theme of a book I wrote with Andreas Kalivas called Liberal Beginnings. Liberalism has bonded with socialism. The welfare state is a kind of liberal socialism. The welfare state has, and you've written about this in your early work, liberalism has bonded with racism, and indeed allowed forms of what I like to call sanitized representation, when Southern Democrats, as soon as they crossed the threshold, despite being elected by almost nobody in a one-party system, became liberal representatives like everybody else. And liberalism has bonded with different kinds of forms of authoritarianism, and we could talk about that. So in the end, the question for liberals and Democrats, and especially for those of us who are liberal Democrats, is not simply, as Nadia put it, to defend, or others have put it, the basic core principles, which I agree with, but it's also to have to confront the hard questions of what kind of liberal democracy should we wish to have, not only whether, but what kind.
Yes, excellent. So, two brief questions, issues. The first one, bureaucracy. Bentham introduced, as we know, the greatest, perhaps, attempt to reorganize the entire state or system and bureaucracy, changing completely the method for recruitment and the method for distribution of goods and services to introduce an element of impartiality, the rule of law, de facto. So today, what we witness, particularly in the transformations of party democracy into populist democracy, is not that the target is not bureaucracy because they want to demolish bureaucracy, but they want to conquer bureaucracy, to politicize bureaucracy to the point that bureaucracy is in the end of those rules, exactly going back against the tradition that Bentham introduced. So the problem, for me, according to me today, I don't know the state, but I know better Europe, is precisely the transformation of party democracy, pluri-party democracy, into a form of, let's see, direct representation, the people as one, represented by leaders, plebiscitary leaders, sometimes creating their own parties, sometimes conquering existing parties, in order to re-achieve and to conquer the state altogether, both institutions and those supposedly autonomous or impartial kind of branches of the state. So it is a kind of hyper-majoritarianism that claims to have the only right say and only legitimate say because it's represented the true people. The true people, the majority as the true people, not as one possible majority or one possible representations of people. So it is, in my view, this one of the several important challenges representative constitutional democracy is facing today. That is, question of division of powers, questions of the rule of impartiality and the limits of political decision-making, divisions between functions of states and parties. Parties are now practically occupying the states altogether, not simply making in the service of the state the constructions of lawmaking. So it is an issue of here liberalism is important, injecting the art of limitation that liberalism was so capable in the age of constructing or constructions of nation states in the 19th century in particular. So, but those days was the liberalism of the few, because liberalism was not a movement, a large movement. It was never, actually. It was always a kind of elite, a kind of movement. And today, for this reason, it's important to re-achieve democracy within the value of liberty I said before, because liberalism cannot do that. It doesn't have any vocation of creating popular or kind of mass parties, but democracy has this power. For this reason, democracy needs to be reinterpreted within the logic for liberties and arts of limitations and distinctions in order to be able to limit itself from inside, which is what today is the most difficult task to achieve, because we are witnessing a transformation of representative democracy and party democracy, de facto very different from the pluralistic kind of party system with the separation of the media from the majority system. So today, it is as if there is a coalescing of all these forces together in the hands of those who claim to represent the true people. I see these as the main issues today.
Can I raise a question maybe everyone might respond to, which relates to some of these comments? For many Americans today, I think liberalism means people who are for big government, right? Big government. And we know liberals, Bill Clinton struggled with how to address that, and of course Ronald Reagan famously attacked big government. But of course, as we know, as realists, pretty much everyone in this room, big government is with us to stay. It's not going anywhere. And the question is who government serves. So how do liberal principles help us either defend government or get away from the necessity to defend government, to talk about what government does instead of government as this, behemoth, supposedly boogeyman, which wants to reach into your lives and control them?
It's true that big government is here to stay, but there is no consensus, certainly not in this country, about what I was earlier calling the rules of transaction between state and economy. Just think of how many executive orders of President Obama have been turned in opposite direction by President Trump. And I'm now not taking sides in this, though I have a preference, but it seems to me both of them were instantiating very different views of the role of government and regulation vis-a-vis the economy. There's a wonderful document which I stumbled across recently again on a shelf of a debate at the American Enterprise Institute about regulation in 1976 that involved Ronald Reagan and Hubert Humphrey, among other people, and in which they both very articulately, both as liberals in the sense we've been using the term, certainly Ronald Reagan was, and certainly Hubert Humphrey was, articulated those points of dispute. And I would think that in democratic life, what's critical is to define as crisply as possible the character of the choices, not just with respect to the economy, but with respect to the nature of interest representation in civil society, the nature of foreign relations. There are a lot of deep, thick, substantive issues, but what's critical for us is that the adjudication take place within the frame, normative and institutional, that we've been calling liberal democracy.
May I say something? So just to add on to what Ira said just now about Herbert Hoover, who argued with FDR and others about the meaning of liberal. Of course, Herbert Hoover was a free market guy, and he said, I'm a liberal. But then a few years later, the word liberal had gotten so associated with FDR and the New Deal that he said, oh, you can have the word. You've raped it of all meaning. But the argument went on about big government and small government. Hayek also, I understand, at one point got very frustrated and said, I started using the word libertarian. People, started to call themselves libertarian, or they'll say, well, we're the classical liberals. You've hijacked the term and polluted it of all meaning. So, and I wanted to ask one more thing, if I may. And, contemporary politics, as people know, it's not my thing. So excuse me if I say something silly now. But we're talking about populism and people and what a problem it is, illiberal democracy and all of this. But is there a good populism and a bad populism? What do we do? Aren't we asking for people in the no? But what does it mean?
Very polarized up here, I can tell.
I'm on the right here.
He's a good.
good
She's
guy.
a bad.
You want to go first? Do you want me to go first? I think, look, I'm an American historian, and whenever I go to conferences in other countries and talk populism conferences, I'm the only person saying a good word for populism. And of course, everyone there is pretty much the leftist, or at least a center leftist. Depend, as usual, how do you define the term, right? But I define it as a political discourse of the moral, hardworking, often God-fearing, but not always, majority against a self-serving, often undemocratic elite. And if you define it that way, then it's a promiscuous language which can be used by different social forces. I think Bernie Sanders talked a language that the original populists in the 1890s would have understood very well. He didn't talk about the big money, but he talked about billionaires, same thing really, and on and on and on. He talked about Wall Street, so did they. I won't continue the analogy. But I think Donald Trump also, spoke, as we know, a language of populism. There's, very quickly, I think you identify two different populist traditions, at least in the United States, with some analogs what's happening in Europe now too, I think. One is the more left-wing populism that Bernie Sanders represents, I think, where you try to sort of fudge or at least minimize the differences ethnically, racially, and otherwise between the people and train all your fire at those at the top, especially those at the top economically, and sometimes politically, if those at the top politically are in bed with those economically. And the other tradition, which is just as strong in the United States, and perhaps in many ways stronger, is one Trump, in his way, represents too, which is there's an ordinary people in the middle, almost all white, of course, and traditionally in America, almost all Christian. That's not true anymore. And they see a conspiracy of sorts between those at the top and those at the bottom with dark skins. And that was true of the anti-Chinese movement in California, late 19th century. It was true in many ways of the Know-Nothings earlier. And I think it's very much Trump's rhetoric of he's running against these liberals and the mainstream media on one hand, and of course he's also trying to stop those murderous immigrants from coming to the country on the other hand. So I think it can be good, but it's a struggle between what kind of populism is going to be dominant, and that's how I see it.
Okay.
May I?
Yeah.
So I would say the following. So populism is so ambiguous that it's impossible to make a definition that can accommodate all the experiences. So leave aside the question
liberalism.
leave aside the question of ontology and try to see populism as a movement, contestation, or in society. Fine, populism is, there are many kinds of movements, and populism is one of those. And populism, when it gets into power, that is, when populism becomes a majority within a constitutional democracy, not all kinds of populism. So we situate now, in our time now, and we see what populism can do in our society, in our democratic representative democracies. So when we see it in power, not as a movement of aspirational desire, rhetorical or construction of the we the people, fine, I mean, it's all parties, they do so, particularly when they go close to election. But when they are in power, we have to see them. Now, there is a tendency of transforming democracy, representative democracy, without going outside, because otherwise we have another regime, within the limits and the borders of constitutional democracy. They make some important changes. For instance, although they don't change perhaps the law to the point that they become fascist kind of regimes, I agree with that, but they are very important in doing some important moves. First, the plebiscitary vocation of putting a leader as the mouth of the people. I am your voice. I am like you, dislike you. Whereas, as we know, in party representation, we are not like. We choose somebody because we consider sometimes even different. So, like you. Second, they use elections as a way of expressing the best which are already there. So the majority is already in society, the majority of the good people. Elections reveals that majority. So elections don't play anymore the game of creating the majority. They reveal a majority. It's a applause, kind of. Third, they transform clearly representations into a game of embodiment. The leader embodies the people, and the people is one thing with the leader. For this reason, in my view, it can be very dangerous when populism becomes a form of government and not simply a movement in society. So this would be.
I would like to, time is running short, so I'm going to allow 2 questioners, and you know, if you want to rush to a microphone.
Have an auction.
People are exhausted.
Yeah.
I think Jim should have a chance to.
Yeah.
Just fine.
Would you like to close on some grace note?
Not necessarily on a grace note, but I agreed with Patrick about one thing, which is that most of us here agree with each other on most of these issues, that both the liberal tradition and the understandings of democracy have changed over time, that they have to be understood within their historical context, that they're different within different national contexts and at different times. But one of the things that I was struck by is how many people spoke about the need for a more robust conception of duty or obligation or affective adhesion to the community. And it does seem to me as though that's one of the reasons why there's been such a crisis in American liberal democracy in the last half century, that this sense of being part of a shared enterprise seems to me to have eroded. And one of the challenges that I think all of us face is to try to find a way, as Danny noted earlier, to make connections with people outside our way of thinking so that we don't seem as alien to them as we do now, and they don't seem as alien to us as they do. So we have a chance to meet again in February, and between now and then I'll be thinking
We're
hard
going to
about
meet
that
again
question.
at 6:30. And we actually
again,
have
in
tried
February.
to create, you know, bring together people who actually disagree.
Yes, very good,
It's
very good.
actually hard.
Yeah.
Okay, till then.
Remember it in the morning, there was one.
Okay.